The wind howled like a starving wolf across the jagged peaks of the Wyoming Rockies. Jedediah, Jed Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of weathered lines and sun-bleached scars, pulled his deerskin cloak tighter around his shoulders. For a decade, these mountains had been his home, their unforgiving terrain, both his greatest challenge and his only sanctuary. But this storm was different. It wasn't just a squall. It was a white fury descending from the north, promising to bury the land beneath a blanket of ice and snow. Jed knew the signs, the unnerving silence of the forest before the first flakes fell, the way the air turned so sharp it felt like it could shatter. His old mule, Bess, plodded ahead, her head low against the biting gusts. They had been on the trail for 3 days, hunting for pelts to trade at the nearest settlement, a dusty speck on the map, a week's ride to the east. The approaching blizzard, however, had turned his plans to dust. Jed squinted, his eyes scanning the treacherous landscape. He needed shelter, and fast. Ahead, a dark fissure opened in the face of a craggy cliff, a cave. It wasn't much, just a jagged mouth leading into the mountain's belly, but it was his only chance. He urged Bess forward, her hooves crunching on the frozen ground. As they neared the entrance, the wind grew stronger, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sounds. He dismounted, leading Bess inside the rocky moor. The air grew still, the roar replaced by the soft whisper of the wind at the cave's mouth. Jed exhaled a long, cloudy breath, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He unburdened Bess of her packs and set to work, lighting a small fire with tinder and a flint he carried. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the uneven walls, revealing the damp, cold stone. He settled near the fire, pulling a piece of dried venison from his pouch. Just as he was about to eat, a low, guttural sound echoed from the deeper recesses of the cave. It was a moan, pained and weak. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the handle of his old hunting knife, a cold dread creeping up his spine. Could it be a bear? A lone wolf? He rose slowly, the sound of his boots on the rocky floor, loud in the silence. He raised his lantern, its beam cutting through the darkness. The light fell upon a small, huddled form, barely visible against the far wall. It wasn't an animal. It was a woman. She was curled into a ball, her body shaking violently, not from the cold, but from some inner torment. Her clothes were torn and caked with mud, a dark stain of blood visible on her ripped dress. Her hair, a tangled mess, fell across a face contorted in pain. Jed's breath hitched. He had seen his share of misfortune in these mountains, but this was different. He saw no weapon, no sign of a trap, just a person in profound agony. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a different, more powerful emotion, compassion. He had to help her. He approached cautiously, his voice a low rumble. "Mom, you're hurt?" The woman didn't respond. Only a small, shuddering gasp escaped her lips. Jed knelt, his lantern revealing the full extent of her injuries. A deep, jagged cut ran down her leg, and her ankle was swollen and discolored. Her face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on her brow. She was delirious, muttering incoherent words. Jed knew he couldn't leave her. The storm outside would surely claim her life. He was a man of the mountains, accustomed to solitude and self-reliance, but he couldn't turn his back on someone so clearly in need. The thought of a young woman dying alone in the cold was a weight he couldn't bear. He had a choice to make, a choice that would change the course of his life, and as the blizzard raged outside, he made it. He would stay and help. The next hours were a blur of action and quiet determination. Jed moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced countless crises. He fetched his canteen and a clean piece of cloth from his pack, using the cold water to clean the woman's wounds. She flinched and cried out as he worked, her pain a tangible thing in the small space. Jed spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, promising her that it would be all right, even though he wasn't sure if it was true. He wrapped her injured leg in a clean bandage, fashioned from a piece of an old shirt. He laid out a bed of his thickest blankets next to the fire, moving her carefully from the cold stone floor to the warmth. She groaned, her body limp in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of protectiveness, of responsibility for another person. As the night wore on, the snow fell relentlessly outside. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on the woman's face. She was young, maybe 20 years old, with high cheekbones and a scattering of freckles. Jed couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to this remote, dangerous place. Who was she, and who had done this to her? She began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. They were a startling shade of green, clouded with fear and pain. She looked at him, her gaze uncertain, then at the cave, and finally at her bandaged leg. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "You're in a cave," Jed said softly. "The storm is bad outside. My name is Jedediah." She was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on his. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "My name is Ilara." Ilara. The name was a soft whisper in the harsh, rocky cave. Jed offered her a sip of water, and she drank it greedily. He gave her a small piece of dried meat, which she ate slowly, as if she were afraid it would disappear. Over the next few days, the blizzard raged. They were trapped, the entrance to the cave a solid wall of snow. Jed spent his time tending to Ilara, cleaning her wounds and keeping the fire burning. He told her stories of the mountains, of the animals he had hunted, and the solitude he had learned to love. Ilara, in turn, told him about her life. She was a homesteader's daughter from a small settlement south of the mountains. She had been on her way to visit her aunt when she was attacked by outlaws. They had ambushed her wagon, stealing her supplies and leaving her for dead. She had managed to escape into the wilderness, but not before she was badly injured. As she healed, Ilara's strength and spirit began to return. She was intelligent and resilient, her fear slowly replaced by a quiet resolve. She helped Jed as much as she could, mending his clothes and sharing what little food they had. They talked for hours, their conversations spanning everything from the harsh realities of life in the West to their dreams for the future. Jed found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't to anyone in years. He felt a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. One afternoon, as the snow finally began to subside, Ilara looked at him, her green eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something warm and tender. "Jedediah," she said, her voice soft, "you saved my life." "Just did what needed doing," he mumbled, a blush creeping up his leathery neck. But he knew it was more than that. He had not only saved her body, but her spirit. And in doing so, he had found something he never thought he would have again, a reason to leave the solitude of the mountains and face the world below. The blizzard had finally broken, leaving a pristine white world in its wake. The cold was still a biting thing, but the sky was a brilliant, clear blue. The snow was deep, making travel slow and treacherous, but Jed knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever. They had a long journey ahead of them. Jed fashioned a makeshift crutch for Ilara from a sturdy piece of wood, and together they began their descent. The journey was difficult. Ilara's ankle was still tender, and every step was an act of pain and endurance. Jed walked beside her, his hand on her back, his presence a constant source of support. He cleared the path of fallen branches and loose stones, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. They traveled for days, their progress measured in inches rather than miles. The mountains, once a familiar comfort to Jed, now felt like a relentless obstacle. He was no longer just a man surviving, he was a protector, responsible for another person's life. As they moved closer to the lowlands, the landscape began to change. The craggy peaks gave way to rolling hills, and then to vast snow-covered plains. The air grew warmer, and the sun felt like a gentle hand on their faces. The signs of civilization began to appear, a distant plume of smoke, a lonely cabin perched on a hillside, the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. Ilara's mood lifted with every mile they covered. She pointed out things she hadn't seen in weeks, a flock of sparrows in the trees, a meandering river, the first green shoots of spring peeking through the snow. Her joy was infectious, a warm glow that filled the air around them. "What will you do, Jedediah?" she asked one evening as they sat by their campfire. "Will you go back to the mountains?" Jed looked at the vast open plains stretching out before them. The mountains were his home, but the thought of returning to his solitary life felt hollow now. "I don't know," he admitted. Maybe I'll go with you, at least for a while. Make sure you get to your aunt's place safely." Ilara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that made his heart beat a little faster. "I would like that very much," she said. The days turned into weeks, and their bond deepened. Jed, once a man of few words, found himself talking freely, sharing his thoughts and fears with Ilara. He saw her not as a damsel in distress, but as a strong, capable woman who had faced incredible hardship and survived. He found himself thinking about her constantly, about the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way she hummed a soft tune as they walked. The feelings were strange and new, and they both scared and exhilarated him. One afternoon they crested a low ridge and saw a small town nestled in a valley below. A plume of black smoke rose from a cluster of buildings. "That's it," Ilara said, her voice filled with relief. "That's where my aunt lives." Jed's heart sank a little. The journey was almost over. He was happy for her, but a part of him dreaded the inevitable separation. He had been a lone wolf for so long, and now he had found a companion, a reason to live beyond survival. As they walked down the final slope, Jed saw a figure approaching them on a horse, a tall, well-dressed man with a rifle slung over his shoulder. The man's face was hard, his eyes cold and calculating. Jed's hand instinctively went to the handle of his own hunting knife. Something was wrong. The air, which had been so full of hope, suddenly felt thick with tension. The man dismounted, his gaze fixed on Ilara. Jed stepped in front of her, his body a shield. The man smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Look what the cat dragged in. I've been looking for you, Ilara." The man's name was Silas Croft. His name carried a weight in the region, associated with a gang of ruthless outlaws. He was the one who had attacked Ilara's wagon. His eyes, as he looked at her, held a terrifying mixture of predatory malice and ownership. He looked past Jed, as if the mountain man were a mere obstacle, a minor inconvenience to be dealt with. "I don't know who you are, mister," Jed said, his voice low and steady, "but this woman is under my protection. You'll leave her be." Silas let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Protection? From who? You? A filthy mountain man?" He gestured to Jed's ragged clothes. "She belongs to me. She was supposed to be my wife. A little bird told me she ran off. I figured I'd find her sooner or later." And Ilara's hand gripped Jed's arm, her fingers trembling. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "My father arranged a marriage with him, but I ran away. I knew what he was, a monster." Silas's face darkened. He pulled his rifle from his shoulder. "I'm not asking you, old man. Get out of the way. This is a family matter." Jed stood his ground. He was a man of the wilderness, not of violence. But he wouldn't abandon Ilara. He had seen the terror in her eyes, and he knew he had to protect her. "I said, you'll leave her be," Jed repeated, his voice gaining a hard edge. Silas's face twisted into a snarl. "You've made your choice," he said. He raised his rifle. Jed, with a speed that belied his age, lunged forward. He slammed into Silas, knocking the rifle from his hands. The two men fell to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Silas was younger, stronger, but Jed was a product of a life of hardship. He was wiry and tough, his movements precise and efficient. He landed a punch to Silas's jaw, a sharp cracking sound that resonated through the still air. Silas staggered, and Jed, seizing the opportunity, grabbed the rifle. He leveled it at Silas, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Get on your horse," Jed commanded, his voice a low growl, "and get out of here." If I ever see you near this town again, I'll put a bullet in you myself." Silas, bruised and humiliated, glared at Jed. "This ain't over, old man. You hear me? This ain't over." He scrambled onto his horse and rode away, a dark speck on the horizon. Jed stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Ilara, her face pale with shock. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around him, a tight, desperate embrace. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Thank you so much." Jed held her, his arms wrapping around her in a protective gesture. The world was no longer just about survival in the mountains. It was about facing down the devils of the world to protect the one person he had come to care about. They finally made it to town, a dusty collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single main street. Ilara's aunt, a kind and bustling woman named Martha, was overjoyed to see her. She embraced Ilara in a tight hug, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Martha insisted that Jed stay with them, a guest of honor for his heroic actions. Jed, who hadn't slept in a real bed in years, accepted gratefully. The town was a world away from the silent solitude of the mountains. It was a place of noise and gossip and commerce. People looked at Jed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He was a stranger, a man who didn't belong in their tidy little world. But they treated him with a grudging respect, a quiet acknowledgement of his actions. Ilara's ankle healed quickly, and she began to regain her strength. She spent her days helping her aunt in the general store, her laughter ringing out across the counter. Jed spent his time doing odd jobs, mending fences and helping with chores. He was no longer a mountain man. He was a part of a community, a new and strange role he was still learning to navigate. Their relationship deepened. They spent their evenings together talking, sharing stories and laughing. Jed found himself falling in love, a feeling as vast and encompassing as the mountains he had left behind. He saw the strength in Ilara, the quiet resilience that had carried her through her ordeal. She saw the gentle heart beneath Jed's rugged exterior, the kindness that had compelled him to save her. But their happiness was not to last. Silas Croft was a man of his word, and a man of his word was also a man of vengeance. He didn't forget a slight. His gang began to terrorize the town, their presence a dark shadow on the horizon. They rode through the streets at night, breaking windows, starting fires, and threatening the townsfolk. They wanted Jed and Ilara to know that they weren't safe, that Silas hadn't forgotten. The town's sheriff was a decent man, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. The townsfolk were terrified, and they looked at Jed with a new light in their eyes. They no longer saw a hero, but a bringer of trouble. The man who had saved them from the elements now seemed to have brought a different kind of storm to their doorstep. One evening, Silas and his men rode into town, their faces hidden behind bandanas. They tied their horses in front of the saloon and began to harass the patrons. A young man, a store clerk, tried to stand up to them. Silas's men beat him viciously, leaving him a bloodied mess on the dusty street. The town was in a state of quiet panic. The townsfolk barricaded themselves in their homes, their fear a palpable thing in the air. Ilara and Jed watched from the window of Martha's store. "We can't just let this happen," Ilara said, her voice tight with anger and frustration. Jed knew she was right. He had to act. He had brought this trouble to the town, and it was up to him to face it. He wasn't a lawman or a gunslinger, but he was a man who knew how to fight for what was right. He looked at Ilara, her face pale but determined. "Go inside," he said. "Stay safe." He walked out onto the street, his hands empty. He was a man of peace, but he was ready for war. Jed's appearance on the street was a silent challenge. The raiders, who had been laughing and whooping, fell silent. Silas, his face a mask of cold fury, stepped forward. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Look what we have here, the hero of the hour." Jed didn't respond. He simply stood there, his back straight, his eyes fixed on Silas. "I told you this wasn't over. Silas said. "You think you can just come here, take what's mine, and walk away? I'm not a man you cross, old man." "She's not a possession," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "She's a person, and you're a coward." Silas's face contorted in rage. "You'll pay for that," he said. He signaled to his men, and they all drew their pistols. The click of the hammers was a chilling sound in the quiet town. Jed knew he couldn't take on all of them. He was a fighter, but he wasn't invincible. But he wasn't alone. The town had been watching, their fear slowly turning to a simmering anger. A man named Thomas, a grizzled farmer with a shotgun, stepped out from the darkness of a doorway. "You'll be leaving now, Silas," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "This town has had enough of you." Another man, the owner of the general store, emerged, a rifle in his hands. Others followed, townsfolk armed with whatever they could find, shotguns, old hunting rifles, even a shovel. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a defiant line of ordinary people who had found their courage in the face of a common threat. Silas's face was a mixture of surprise and disgust. "You'll stand up to me for a worthless old man and a runaway girl?" he spat. "Not for them," Thomas said. "For ourselves, for this town. You're not welcome here." A tense standoff ensued. Silas knew he was outnumbered. He looked at the faces of the townsfolk, their determination a silent wall of defiance. He knew he couldn't win this fight. Not now. Not like this. He let out a frustrated growl. "This isn't the end," he snarled. "You'll hear from me again. Count on it." He mounted his horse and rode away, his men following close behind, their faces a mixture of fear and humiliation. The townsfolk watched them go, a collective sigh of relief echoing through the streets. They turned to Jed, their faces filled with gratitude. He was no longer a stranger, but a part of their community. He had not only protected Ilara, but had inspired them to fight for themselves. The town began to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. The fear that had held them captive for so long was replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. Jed, once the lone wanderer, was now a central figure in their community. The townsfolk offered him work, and he accepted it with a quiet grace. He mended fences, helped with the harvest, and even taught some of the younger boys how to track and hunt. Ilara and Jed's relationship deepened. They spent their days together, working side by side in the general store or taking long walks in the fields. Their love story was a quiet, steady flame, built not on grand gestures, but on shared struggle, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding affection. They were two halves of a whole, two lost souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Martha's home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jed turned to Ilara. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and a little shaky, I don't want to go back to the mountains. Not alone, anyway." Ilara's eyes, those brilliant green eyes, filled with tears. She took his hand in hers. "Then don't," she whispered. "Stay here. Stay with me." Jed's heart swelled. Will you marry me?" he asked, the words a question he had never thought he would ask. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a powerful and profound joy. 1,000 times. Yes. They were married in the town church, a simple, beautiful ceremony. The entire town attended, their faces filled with genuine happiness for the unlikely couple. Jed, in his best clothes, looked less like a mountain man and more like a man who had finally found his home. Ilara, in a simple white dress, was radiant. They had no family to give them away, so the townsfolk, their new family, stood in for them. Their love was a testament to the power of human connection, a beacon of hope in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. They built a life together, a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They had found their sanctuary not in a cave, but in each other's arms. Their happiness, however, was a fragile thing. Silas Croft, as he had promised, did not forget his humiliation. He had spent the last few months gathering his men, recruiting new, more ruthless outlaws, and planning his revenge. He wasn't just coming for Jed and Ilara now, he was coming to burn the entire town to the ground. News of his return came through a frightened traveler, a merchant who had been ambushed on the road. The man, his face pale with fear, warned them that Silas was leading a large, well-armed gang, and he was on a warpath. The townsfolk, who had found their courage once, were now filled with a new and deeper fear. Silas was a different man now. He was more dangerous, more desperate. The sheriff, with a heavy heart, admitted that they couldn't fight them on their own. Jed and Ilara stood together, their hands clasped. They knew this was their fault, that their love had brought this storm down upon the town. They couldn't ask the townsfolk to risk their lives for them again. They had to leave. They packed what they could, their hearts heavy with sadness and guilt. The townsfolk, though frightened, tried to convince them to stay. "You're our friends," Thomas said, his eyes pleading. "We'll fight with you." "No," Jed said, his voice firm. "This is our fight. We can't ask you to die for us." That night, under the cover of darkness, Jed and Ilara slipped out of town. Their destination, the mountains. The same mountains that had once provided them with a sanctuary were now their only hope for survival. Jed knew the terrain better than anyone, every cave, every hidden trail, every treacherous pass. He would use his knowledge to evade Silas and his men, to lead them on a wild chase and then lose them in the wilderness. The chase began the next morning. Silas and his men, a horde of black-clad riders, rode into the town, their faces twisted in a grotesque parody of fury. They found the town empty, the streets silent save for the wind. The only thing they found was a note pinned to the door of the saloon, a message from Jed. "You're a coward, Silas," it read. "Come and get me." Silas roared in frustration. He knew where they were going. He knew Jed was leading him into his own territory, but his pride, his lust for revenge, was too great. He and his men rode out of town, a cloud of dust trailing behind them. The chase was relentless. Jed, with Ilara on the back of his horse, led them on a grueling, circuitous path through the mountains. He used every trick he knew, crossing rivers to hide their scent, traveling at night, and using the treacherous terrain to their advantage. He was a ghost, a shadow in his own home. Silas and his men were frustrated, their tempers fraying. They were city men, not mountain men. They were lost and cold, and the mountains, with their unforgiving terrain and biting winds, were a hostile, alien place to them. Finally, after days of this grueling chase, Jed led them to a narrow, treacherous pass. It was a place he knew well, a place that could only be crossed on foot, a place where a single man with a rifle could hold off an entire army. They dismounted, their horses exhausted. "This is it," Jed said, his voice grim. "This is where we end it." Ilara's face was pale, but her eyes held a fierce determination. She stood beside him, her hand in his. "I'm with you," she said. Jed hid Ilara in a small crevice, giving her his rifle. "If I don't make it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you ride. Ride until you're safe. Don't look back." "No," she said, her voice firm. "We're in this together, and we're getting out of this together." Jed gave her a sad smile. He took up a position on a high rock overlooking the pass. He waited, his heart pounding, his body humming with a strange, calm energy. He wasn't a hero, just a man fighting for the woman he loved. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the pass. Silas and his men appeared, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and fury. They saw Jed, a lone figure on the rock. Silas let out a triumphant roar. "There he is, the old mountain man, now you'll pay!" Jed didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle and fired. A single shot echoed through the mountains, and a man fell from his horse. Chaos erupted. Jed fired again, a practiced, lethal shot that struck another man. The men, rattled and disoriented, scattered, trying to find cover. Jed was a sharpshooter, a master of his craft. He picked them off one by one, his shots finding their mark with a deadly accuracy. Silas, in a fit of rage, charged up the pass, his pistol drawn. He was a man consumed by his own arrogance and blind fury. He saw only Jed, not the treacherous rocks, not the narrow path. He stumbled, his foot slipping on a loose stone. He fell, his body tumbling down the rocky slope, a sickening series of thuds and cracks. His body came to a rest at the bottom, a broken, lifeless heap. The remaining raiders, defeated and demoralized, turned and fled, leaving their dead behind them. The silence that followed was a profound, heavy thing. Jed stood on the rock, his heart racing, his rifle still smoking. He had done it. He had faced the darkness and won. He walked to Ilara, who emerged from her hiding place, her face streaked with tears. She ran into his arms, and they held each other, the relief and the grief a powerful, overwhelming wave. They had survived. They had won. But at what cost? They returned to the town, not as defeated fugitives, but as quiet, weary heroes. The townsfolk greeted them with a mix of relief and reverence. They saw the weariness in Jed's eyes, the quiet sadness in Ilara's. They knew the price they had paid. Jed and Ilara didn't want a celebration. They simply wanted to be home, together. They spent the next few weeks in quiet solitude, healing from their ordeal, both physically and emotionally. The town, in their absence, had become stronger, more united. The absence of fear had allowed them to grow, to find their own strength. Jed, the man who had once been a solitary wanderer, was now a cornerstone of the community. He taught the townsfolk how to hunt, how to track, how to survive. Ilara, his wife, became a pillar of the community, a symbol of hope and resilience. They lived a quiet, peaceful life, a life built on a foundation of love and shared struggle. They had faced the darkest corners of the human heart and had found a way to not only survive, but to thrive. They had found their sanctuary, not in a cave, but in each other. And as the years passed, they became a living legend, a story passed down from generation to generation, a testament to the fact that even in the most dangerous and unforgiving of times, love and human decency could always find a way to flourish.